All right, so the book I'm reading today, I'm starting as probably going to be the first one I'm going to upload, is called Classic Video Games. It's by Brian Eddy. This is the cover. It's called Classic Video Games: The Golden Age, 1971 to 1984. All right. This is chapter one. I'm going to read just chapter one in this video book. In the beginning, an industry is launched 1971 to 1977. Chapter one. Arcade games have been amusing young and old alike for more than a century. Although electronic games were invented as early as the late 1940s, it wasn't until decades later that the golden age of video games would be born, as arcade games like coin-operated pinball gave way to electromechanical games and later to fully electronic video games. The birth of the first commercial stand-up video arcade game occurred in 1971 with the release of Computer Space. Most games of this era were very simple with black and white graphics and color screen overlays. They introduced players to the idea of playing a game on a video screen. Some initial successes in this time period, like Pong, alerted the public to this new form of entertainment, but it had yet to reach mass appeal. Games started showing up in bars, pool and pinball halls, bowling alleys, and other places of entertainment. Although the games were simple, it was the start of a trend. Computer Space. Computer Space was created by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, who later formed Atari. Widely considered the first commercial video game, it was produced by Nutting Associates, and it set the format for future video game machines by putting a standalone game with a video screen in an upright cabinet that accepted money for play. Computer Space featured a cabinet unique even by today's standards, as it was made of fiberglass and had a flowing wraparound design in a variety of colors, most in a sparkly metal flake paint. Computer Space was based on a computer game called Space Wars that was developed in 1961 at Massachusetts Institute of Technology using one of the first mini-computers, the PDP-1. Space Wars was never available to the public. In Computer Space, the player controlled a rocket ship with a thrust button and two directional rotation buttons. Against the backdrop of stars, enemy flying saucers would move across the screen and try to shoot and destroy the player. In turn, the player pressed a button that would shoot missiles in an attempt to destroy the enemy saucers. The game was played in rounds that lasted 90 seconds. If the player had the most kills, he could continue for another 90 seconds. If not, it was game over. This sequence continued until the player lost to the enemy saucers. Initially released as a one-player game, Computer Space later was released in two-player versions, and the directional rotation buttons were changed to joysticks. This version allowed players to compete head-to-head. While the game was popular on college campuses, it was not a success for the general public and sold only 1,500 units. The gameplay was considered too complex to grasp for an average player who was just having a pint at the pub. Pong. In 1972, Bushnell and Dabney formed Atari Inc. with money raised by the profits from Computer Space. Pong was the company's first game, and it is considered the first commercially successful arcade game, eventually selling 35,000 units. The game was created by Atari employee Al Alcorn and was inspired by a similar game on the Magnavox Odyssey home video game system, which Bushnell had seen in a demonstration while visiting Magnavox. Pong is a video version of tennis for one or two players. Each player has a paddle on the opposite side of the screen used to hit a ball back and forth. If one player misses, the other scores a point. The player with the most points wins. The simplicity and head-to-head competition of this classic game made Pong an instant hit. For many, it was the first video game that they had ever played. Pong's success led to it being widely cloned by others in the arcade and home market, and it remains one of the most famous arcade games ever made. Gunfight. In 1975, Midway Manufacturing, a pinball and mechanical coin-operated device maker established in 1932, released the popular game Gunfight, which was based on the Japanese Taito game Western Gun. The game was black and white but included a yellow screen overlay to simulate color. A Western-themed shootout, Gunfight featured a unique controller layout with two joysticks. Players moved the character on screen and provided a trigger to shoot a gun at their opponent. The the other controlled the game with the gun. Players could square off against the computer or a human opponent. The one with the most hits won. Gunfight is notable for a number of firsts in an arcade game. It was the first to be controlled by a central microprocessor instead of separate circuits, and it was the first successful Japanese arcade video game to be exported to North America. It also was the first arcade video game to feature a gun on screen, a trend that would continue into the foreseeable future. Night Driver. In late 1976, Atari introduced Night Driver, the first arcade driving game to feature first-person perspective graphics. This made players feel like they were in the car looking through the windshield when driving. The simple game consisted of black and white markers to define the road as it moved toward the player. In Night Driver, the player used a steering wheel to control the vehicle, a gas pedal to move forward, and a 4-position gear shifter to go as fast as possible down a winding road at night. The longer the player drove without crashing, the faster the car would go, the more points scored, and the harder it became to maintain control through the turns. This increasing speed led to an adrenaline rush for players trying to survive as long as they could before crashing. When time ran out, the game was over. Night Driver came in two popular formats, an upright cabinet and a flagship sit-down fiberglass cockpit. Night Driver was available in a sit-down cockpit version with full car controls. Due to technology limitations, the car the player is driving in. Night Driver was not drawn on the screen. Instead, it was printed on a plastic insert placed on top of the video screen. Breakout. Also in 1976, Atari introduced the black and white ball and paddle game with a color overlay. Breakout was similar to Pong but turned on its side. The player used the paddle controller to keep a ball in play and hit it toward a wall of bricks. When the ball hit a brick, it would rebound and the brick would disappear. The goal was to score the most points by removing all the bricks before missing 3 balls with your paddle. The format of this game spawned countless variations and clones and is still a popular gameplay format today. It also spawned a sequel, Super Breakout, in 1978. Breakout was developed by Atari's 40th employee, Steve Jobs, who was aided by video game enthusiast Steve Wozniak. The two later would go on to found Apple Computer using parts borrowed, quote-unquote, from Atari to build their first Apple iComputer prototype. Breakout was available in an upright cabinet and a fun circular sit-down cabinet design. Space Wars is one of the only video arcade games to require 2 players. There is no single-player option. Space Wars. Released in 1978, Space Wars essentially was an updated version of Computer Space based on the same PDP-1 mini-computer video game of the same name originally developed in 1961 at MIT. It had one significant difference. It was the first arcade video game to use a vector graphics display. Up to this point, all games used a raster monitor, which paints the screen with dots like a television. Vector displays work much like an oscilloscope by drawing discrete lines for every object on the screen. This allowed very fluid motion and created a whole category of games. Shortcomings in the technology eventually led to the raster method being the dominant display technology within a few years. The Space Wars cabinet was much wider than most arcade machines, so that 2 people could play side by side. This made the machine heavy and difficult to move. Computer Space, Pong, and just a few other games launched the golden age of arcade games as players began flocking to this new version of entertainment. During the course of the next decade, the popularity of video games would explode, bringing lasting pop culture icons into the mainstream. Asteroids was one of the highest-selling vector screen arcade games ever made. And that's chapter 1.